and I'll turn it over to Matt to kick off the next session.
Great, yeah. We are going to move on to equity, access, and inclusion in the outdoors next for our session. We'll be talking for 45 minutes, about until 1:45, and then we'll have a 15-minute break for folks to stretch their legs for a second, go get whatever they need. But yeah, this has been a topic that came up a little bit yesterday in some conversations we heard from Colorado in their first session about making specific callouts for equity in some of their planning processes. And we have a couple great speakers that we'll let Kaylin, the Outdoor Rec Director of the Oregon State Office, he can do the introductions there, and I'll pull up some slides shortly. So you can take it away, Kaylin.
Thanks. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. So one of the goals of the network is to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion in the outdoor sector. And for this session, there's sort of two goals. The first is to provide a research lens on the nature gap, which at the most basic level is a fact that people of color, low-income communities, and families with children are deprived of some of the benefits of access to nature. And secondarily, to examine and discuss some policy and program recommendations that are embedded in sort of the same nature gap report. And to present on both of those topics, we're joined by Jenny Rowland Shea, who's a senior policy analyst for public lands at the Center for American Progress, with expertise on a range of land management and natural resource issues. Prior to joining CAP, she worked at the National Wildlife Federation, focusing on climate change and energy policy issues. Jenny holds a master's degree in geography from George Washington University and a bachelor's from the University of Delaware, and is originally from Santa Fe, New Mexico. And with Jenny as a co-author on this report that was shared with the network when it was released in July of last year, Sean Edberg, who works to promote environmental stewardship in the Latino community as the Hispanic Access Foundation's Director of Conservation Programs. She also works to elevate Latino voices in conservation policy, activate Latino conservation leaders, and provide them with resources they need to create a more sustainable and just future. Prior to joining Hispanic Access Foundation, Shauna's background includes working on sustainable development at the World Bank and Global Environment Facility, as well as climate policy at the nonprofit Climate Interactive. She earned her master's in Latin American Studies and International Economics from Johns Hopkins, and a BA in International Studies from Johns Hopkins. Shauna lives in Baltimore, Maryland. And with that, I'll hand it over to our two speakers. And after they present, I'll go into moderating, and we'll just encourage audience questions and dialogue at that time. Thanks.
Thanks, Kaylin. And thanks, Matt, for doing these slides. I think you can skip forward a couple of slides since Kaylin already introduced us, and we can just get started. Yeah, so thank you for, I think you can go one more forward, maybe? Perfect, thank you. So yeah, thank you for having us. And as Kaylin said, we'll be talking through a report that CAP and Hispanic Access put out this summer, looking at the unequal distribution of nature in the US and the racial and economic disparities that exist in accessing nature. Before we started this analysis, we knew anecdotally that there are disparities in access to nature, but we wanted a data-driven analysis to understand the scope and scale of that problem. So we worked with a team of scientists called Conservation Science Partners on the data analysis that spans the lower 48 states and Washington, D.C. Apologies to Alaska and Hawaii. It is very hard to get the same kind of data there as it is for the rest of the country. But we use that data from previous work that we did with CSP on natural area loss that used dozens of data sets that found that the US is losing a football field of natural area every 30 seconds. And so we overlaid that data on natural area loss with census data on race, ethnicity, income, and family structure to figure out how the losses were distributed among socioeconomic and racial groups. In addition to national data, we have really rich data on nature deprivation at the census tract level and aggregated at the state level. So we present our findings primarily in terms of nature deprivation, which is referring to a census tract or a community as nature deprived if it has a higher proportion of natural area lost to human activity than the state level median. So basically what that means is that what qualifies as nature deprived varies based on the state. So nature deprivation, as we're defining it in Wyoming, is going to look different than in New Jersey, for example. But the nature gap essentially is referring to the disparities that exist in people's access to parks, beaches, waterways, and other natural areas. All right, so we can move on to the next slide. That is some of our findings. And our findings, as you can see, not only confirmed our hunches, but showed just how serious the problem is. Our primary finding is that communities of color are 3 times more likely than their white counterparts to live in an area that's nature deprived. So there's a huge disparity between white communities and Black, Latino, and Asian communities, as well as to a lesser extent, Native American communities as well. If we go to the next slide, we can see the story is similar when we look at income differences. Low income communities are more likely than moderate and high income communities to live in a nature deprived area by about 20%. And that this likelihood is compounded for populations that are both low income and non-white. On the next slide is one of our really shocking results in this data was finding that families with children under 18 are almost twice as likely to be nature deprived. And not only that, again, we're seeing that non-white families with children are twice as likely as white families with children to not have as much nature nearby. If we go on to slide 8, we can see some of the state data that we have. And if you're thinking that this isn't a problem in my state, you're probably wrong. According to our data, it's a little bit hard to read on these slides, I know, but these trends are almost universal, with exceptions in DC and New Mexico. But the nature gap is particularly acute in some regions. For example, some states in the Northeast have as much as white households are as much as 9 times more likely to have nature nearby than non-white households. And you can see the map on the left. We have kind of created a hotspot map where areas in red are areas where high proportions of people of color, low-income households, and nature-deprived locations are kind of all in the same spot. The next couple of slides quickly look at nature gap for the DMV area, the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area, just to kind of give an example of what we have. You can see the really stark disparity in nature access when it comes to race in Virginia. Income-wise, the disparity kind of disappears in Virginia, but then Maryland, you can see, has a similar racial disparity, but we see that disparity continues for low-income people not having nature access. The next slide is just a hotspot map kind of zoomed into that area, so you can see what it looks like. DC is somewhat interesting in that its hotspots are clustered not in the district itself, but kind of in the surrounding suburbs. But you can see we have this kind of data for all of the states in the lower 48, and you can see that we have it by the census tract level. So you can really kind of zoom into a more local level. The next slide looks at the Four Corners region, and I'm showing that because as part of the analysis, we also looked specifically at which communities were most impacted by the energy development aspect of nature loss, and found that when you're looking at that specifically, Native American communities are disproportionately affected, and a lot of this impact is happening on or near the Navajo Nation and other tribal lands, where there's a lot of oil and gas drilling on both federal lands as well as state lands there. And despite the fact that I had mentioned New Mexico is one of the only states without a noticeable nature gap at the statewide level, when you zoom in, you see that some of the disparities do exist and become more apparent. Similarly, in New Mexico, I don't have a map for this, but we find that Hispanic and Latino populations in the border region are showing up as hotspots as well. And I think with that, I will pass to Shauna to talk a little bit about the next slide.
Right, so I want to address why there is a nature gap, why it exists, because you can't address the problem without knowing how it came about. And I don't know if this needs to be said, but it's not because people of color really want to live in concrete jungles. So next slide. As you might be aware, the history of European settlement in the US is also a history of land theft, dispossession, and forced migration of Native American tribes. So that is one massive factor that has totally shaped the geography and the ecology of our nation. And when it came to the building of our cities, suburbs, and rural communities, the practice of redlining left the US population deeply segregated to this day. And the choice was made to invest in wider communities, to develop and maintain parks and green spaces there, and unfortunately to neglect communities of color, leaving them without the same amenities, or even if they had the amenities, keeping them neglected and unmaintained. On top of that, as we've talked a little bit about in regards to energy, but when it comes to highways, landfills, oil and gas wells, any sort of large infrastructure, the choice was made and continues to be made to place these things away from white communities and often directly on top of communities of color. And I mean that quite literally. And of course, we're still dealing with the legacy of Jim Crow, as events this summer and ongoing have made clear, where Black people were barred from entering parks and beaches and from joining the workforce that maintains our national parks and public lands. So these outright racist policies might not continue today, but the effects of this discrimination linger on in policies that allow, for example, wealthy coastal landowners to bar the public from enjoying the beach near their property. And in the fact that our natural resources and conservation workforce remains overwhelmingly white. So when we talk about having access to nature, it's not just about having nature nearby. People also have to be able to get there and to enjoy these spaces and feel welcome with language and cultural accessibility. So having the nature near is just the bare minimum for all that to happen, for the outdoor recreation to happen. And we don't even have that bare minimum for so many Americans. So there is a lot of work to do. Next slide. Next slide, please. I'm not seeing any slide changes, but I can just keep talking.
Yeah. I think there might be some delay, but just go ahead. Keep going.
Okay. Right, so why does it matter that communities of color are facing the nature gap? It matters because having any kind of nature near you at any scale, from a single tree on your street to a river to a national park, has tons of benefits that communities of color and low-income communities are missing out on. To start with, natural areas allow recreation, of course, that promotes active lifestyles. And this is important during normal times when not enough Americans get the physical activity they need every day, and especially important in pandemic times when being outdoors is the safest way to get out of our homes and exercise and take a break. Nature reduces pollution, which is so important for a lot of reasons, but especially for communities of color, which are more likely to suffer from respiratory diseases due to local pollution. And we know that air pollution causes COVID-19 symptoms to be more severe. So pollution reduction by way of more nature, more outdoor recreation should be a top priority for public health. And again, on the subject of health, having nature nearby reduces stress and can also help alleviate depression and anxiety. It simply makes you happier, especially during this time of stress and cabin fever. And lastly, greenery provides protection from extreme heat and flooding, both of which we'll see a lot more of due to climate change, and which communities of color are especially vulnerable to and likely to face. So greenery protects from these climate hazards, while also simultaneously absorbing the greenhouse gas emissions and mitigating climate change. So all of these incredible benefits are missing for so many communities of color, low-income communities, and children, as we said, who see a big boost in school performance and attendance when they have access to nature. Moving on.
Yeah, and I think I'll take this one. And so why does that matter to states and state offices of outdoor recreation? I think obviously for all of the reasons that Shauna just said, but state offices of outdoor recreation have an additional incentive for both protecting lands and enabling this equitable access to that land, because without adequate places for members of a community, including people of all backgrounds and abilities, to get outside, outdoor recreation could be stifled, and embracing access and expanding the universe of people who see outdoor recreation as an option can help drive states' economies and their outdoor recreation economies. So as we move on to the next slide, we'll move to the policy side of things and kind of how states can close the nature gap and what is your role in all of this. So we go forward one or two more slides. I'll just keep going because I think there's a little bit of a delay. But I did want to set the national stage a little bit because one, it's about to change a lot. And I think that states and the federal government can be great partners, and that there are many places where the goals of the incoming Biden administration will overlap with the goals of states on outdoor recreation. So the incoming administration has made it clear that they will focus on 4 areas: the economy, equity, COVID, and climate, all of which I think apply directly to this conversation and to outdoor recreation. We're all aware that access to outdoor recreation can boost local economies, and I think it's clear that there's a huge opportunity to increase equity and access to. So making that case that outdoor recreation is an area of an opportunity to the Biden administration will be crucial. They've also adopted a platform of protecting 30% of lands and waters by 2030, the 30 by 30 proposal, and finding where outdoor recreation can plug into that effort and what states' biggest asks are when it comes to that will be important information to get to a new administration. And then I just, I'm sure this has been talked about probably earlier, even in this program yesterday, but flagging 2 big sources of funding that I think could serve state leaders to think about how they might be able to fit in. First, the environmental justice plan that the Biden administration committed to. They committed to targeting 40% of all investments and 40% of benefits to disadvantaged communities. And so that was specifically, I think, within the context of clean energy, but I think we can expect that commitment will go beyond clean energy into many other policy areas. And so I think, thanks to the Great American Outdoors Act, the administration has now a ton of new money to spend on Land and Water Conservation Fund, on the Outdoor Recreation Legacy Partnership that focuses on outdoor recreation in urban areas. And there's a ton of statewide funding on this. I'm sure you guys talked about that. And so I think the Biden administration will be using likely that 40% commitment maybe there, and we'll be looking for projects that increase equity and close the nature gap for LWCF and ORLP. And then I think next slide, pass it back to Shauna.
Right. So overall, what we are recommending can be summarized as more nature, closer to home, managed inclusively and locally, that is accessible and welcoming to all. And it's clear from our data that where this accessible and inclusive nature is most needed is in cities, near communities of color, and low-income communities. So as Jenny said, how do you get more nature nearby? Using existing sources of funding like the Land and Water Conservation Fund, tying your outdoor areas into the new momentum to protect 30% of lands and waters by 2030, known as the 30 by 30 initiative. And 30 by 30, while we may hope that it could become state and national policy, it has to start at home. And so our local parks can be a part of that 30%. Next slide. You can also start by looking inward to your own agencies. As we mentioned earlier, having nearby nature is necessary but not sufficient for accessible, inclusive, and equitable outdoors. So in order to get the biggest public health, economic, and other benefits from outdoor recreation, you need people to feel comfortable getting to and using and enjoying their parks. And in order to break down some of these barriers, the alienation, the potential transportation needs, potential cultural barriers that people of color often encounter in the outdoors, you have to know that what those barriers are and how to overcome them. So you can start doing that by making sure that your agency is truly representative of the community that it serves and centering those voices and those needs in your planning. One way to get started making those changes is by partnering with us. At Hispanic Access Foundation, we have a workforce development program that we call the MANO program, which places young Latino students and professionals as interns at the U.S. Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife, and other conservation-oriented agencies and other organizations. And we're always looking for new partners, and we can help you find talented Latino scholars for your office. So I will post that website link in the chat in a moment. Next slide. Community consultation and engagement is also really important, so that you're hearing the needs of the people who are impacted and engaging with them. You have to build trust and demonstrate that you'll follow through on your commitments. One big example where communities of color have often been failed, frankly, leading to a lack of trust, is when it comes to maintenance, because unmaintained outdoor spaces can easily become unsafe outdoor spaces that are no longer accessible. And it may be obvious, but it's still a low-hanging fruit for a lot of places. Providing resources in the languages that your community speaks, which may not always be English. Next slide. In addition to the fact that we all live and work and recreate on Indigenous ancestral lands, the U.S. is legally required to respect tribal sovereignty, which includes sovereignty over natural resources and access to nature. And a lack of meaningful consultation with Indigenous groups has been a big driver of nature loss in tribal lands, especially with oil and gas development, as we've talked about. When Indigenous communities are not just consulted, but actively co-managing conservation lands, studies show that outcomes are better across a wide range of indicators. Biodiversity, ecosystem health, and human health and economies all benefit from Indigenous co-management. Next slide. Education and outreach programs can make outdoor recreation more accessible to families who may not have been able to participate in the past. And involving schools can get a broad segment of underserved communities outdoors. You can also participate in initiatives such as Hispanic Access Foundation's Latino Conservation Week, which organizes events that are targeted by and for the Latino community to get people recreating outdoors and making it easy and fun. So some of our favorite past events were a Spanish-speaking birding bus tour, a trails and tacos hike, a beekeeping mixer. And of course, in 2020, all of these events looked a little bit different. They were virtual or at home or involved mailing care packages with educational activities. But we frequently partner with state, local, and federal agencies on these events. And we'd love to have you participate in Latino Conservation Week 2021, which is in July. So that's another link that I'll have to drop in the chat. Next slide. Recognize that nature and outdoor recreation is a cross-cutting issue with cross-cutting benefits and implications. So transportation is one topic that's really important to this discussion because people of color have lower car ownership rates, meaning that public transit and bicycle and walking infrastructure could get you more bang for your buck on park accessibility. And then on the flip side of transportation, it can also be a problem. Parks can be made inaccessible by things like highways and car infrastructure. Just a few blocks from where I live, we have this big, beautiful park that was designed to be the Central Park of Baltimore, but the Black neighborhood directly to its west has a hard time just crossing the street to get to the park because the street in question is a multi-lane highway. And as I've said, outdoor recreation is also a public health issue. Doctors are giving out nature prescriptions for patients to spend time outdoors, and every dollar spent on trail maintenance saves $3 in healthcare costs. So try and think whether you can form partnerships to leverage these health benefits and increase participation in outdoor recreation. Next slide, and I'll turn it back to Jenny.
Thanks, Shauna. To finish up here, I just wanted to name a few specific policy examples that states are already implementing that get at a lot of the categories that Shauna just named. This is really just scratching the surface, and I'm sure people are doing much more than this, so please don't be upset if I miss something you're doing because I am already sure that I will miss it. But just a few examples. expanding the federal Every Kid in a Park program to apply to state lands. Nevada passed legislation giving free access to state parks for all 5th graders. Maryland's Park Service honors the federal pass at its state parks. Several states, including Wyoming, Colorado, Maine, offer some version of a program to offer free admission to state parks, either permanently or during particular months, certain days, or to youth, veterans, active military, things along those lines. Lots of states have programs to get kids and underserved communities into the outdoors, removing transportation and other barriers. Colorado's GOCO program awards grants and to projects that will help get kids outside, among other things. New Mexico's Outdoor Recreation Equity Fund, which I know we'll all be hearing a lot more about from the experts in the next session, will provide micro grants to provide outdoor experiences for primarily low-income children in the state. California has a program focused on coastal education and access for students. One critical aspect of grant programs that I think should be an emphasis when putting together these types of programs is funding organizations that are led by people of color that are already doing the work to connect the communities to public lands. These are not always programs that need to be or should be started from scratch, but identifying who is already doing the work. Outdoor curriculum, there are a ton of examples here, but Oregon has the Outdoor School for All law. Washington State has a program to license outdoor early learning and childcare programs. State conservation corps are a great gateway to young people interested in learning about the outdoors, including careers in outdoor recreation and management. And when done thoughtfully, they can be used to engage underserved communities as well. One example, the Montana Conservation Corps and the Montana Wilderness Association have worked with the Blackfeet Nation to create a lands crew composed of youth from the Blackfeet tribe to improve recreational access near important tribal lands. And then I don't have an example for this, but the outdoor recreation for the last one, but the outdoor recreation industry, of course, represents a resource for the expansion of small businesses in rural communities and communities of color. So state can identify resources for small business development and then help connect these communities to those resources. And then next slide, I think is maybe our last or. And so, yeah, you can find CAPS reports on americanprogress.org, but also just feel free to reach out to me. I think my contact information is on the next slide. Yeah, feel free to reach out directly with questions, or if you want any more access to the data, we're happy to share that. Or if you want to chat about any of the great stuff your state is doing. Yeah.
Thank you both so much. I see a question in from Tara, which I'll turn to next. And I just wanted to circle back to a topic that you discussed that our network has spent a lot of time talking about over the last year, which is obviously the pandemic and managing recreation use through the pandemic. And as you mentioned off the top, COVID-19 and some of the resultant restrictions on both travel as well as park closures sort of exacerbated some elements of the nature gap. And I'm just wondering whether, from your perspectives, the recommendations in the report have either changed or if any have been reinforced, as we've spent more time over the last, I guess it's been another 6 months since the report came out. Are there newer emerging things that seem to be resonating or examples you've seen specific to COVID?
I can start by just, you already said this and so did Shauna, but that COVID really made all of this more apparent and more high stakes. All of the long running environmental justices, like concentration of toxic air pollution, water pollution near communities of color, have just been exacerbated. And you're seeing, higher virus related hospitalizations and deaths among communities of color. So it really brought this, I think, to the forefront. So I think all of the policy areas still apply that we've noted, but I would say one thing that maybe I would add is just that, we don't know what Congress will do in terms of a stimulus and getting money to states, but should states receive like stimulus money, I know that there are many areas that are in need of funding, but I think there's an argument to be made that outdoor recreation has never been so valuable and should be invested in with some of those funds.
Thank you. And we've seen, and I'll just call out Pitt grew from Utah in particular. Some states are trying to put together, or have put together actual data to back up that anecdotal notion that the outdoors was incredibly popular. This year I'm doing something similar in Oregon to at least try and help make that case in my own state legislature. But just, when back in March and April and May, especially when the restrictions were sort of at their most tight, at least here in Oregon, I got a lot of feedback from members of the public saying it's not realistic for me to recreate locally. I don't have any options there. And so it really, really hit home. Tara's question in the chat was looking for more examples of recreation infrastructure built, recreation amenities, built for tribal groups. I'm not sure if either of you have more examples on that, or if folks on the call do and want to add in chat, but I'll see if you do.
So I would love to hear if anybody has examples that they'd like to share.
So it looks like we're getting a little bit of conversation in the chat on that topic. One thing you mentioned, and I'm asking this sort of purely out of naivete, is around the 30 by 30 initiative, and just curious if you can go back to that and share any really discrete examples that you've seen so far of what states are doing or how they're getting engaged. I have been aware of it obviously for some number of months now, but since it's not my focus at the state level, I haven't really tried to connect the dots of what that federal goal and initiative means for what my state could do. So either recommendations or examples there.
I'm happy to start, or Shauna, you can feel free.
Go for it.
So yeah, I mean, I think the 30 by 30 initiative is obviously new, and so discrete examples of states kind of plugging in are not abundant. I think taking on the goal is probably the first step, and we've seen, California had an executive order from their governor asking the state to, and various different departments within the state, to start looking into that. North Carolina similarly had a bill that has been introduced and is sponsored by people across the aisle, that for 30 by 30. I don't think it's gotten a vote yet, as far as I know, but so they're working on that. And so I think everything in the states is very kind of early stages. But I think, 30 by 30 at large is kind of something that should, in my mind, remain flexible so that, it can be implemented on a local scale. I don't think it's something that, even if the Biden administration, adopts that and has things that they want to do with it, I don't think a top-down approach will work on that. So I think states will be critical in identifying what makes sense in their state for getting to this goal.
I just want to invite network members to either come off mute or to add questions in the chat. And Matthew, please help if I'm missing any relevant questions for the panelists in the chat. Otherwise, I'll just...
Yeah, Kaylin, this is Bevan. I was just going to mention on that 30 by 30 goal. I worked in the Chesapeake Bay restoration and preservation for 10 years. So I can look at the Bay Agreement because we definitely have land conservation goals in there and then strategies to achieve them and things like that. So that's something we can share with the network.
Cool, thank you. A question from Lauren in Pennsylvania. What was the data source or sources for the Nature Gap report? Could you circle back to that a little bit to just talk more about how the analysis happened? And I'll just say for a second that, I was really interested in this report and wanted to make the invitation to have you address the group, because there's findings here that while our statewide comprehensive outdoor recreation plan had a similar focus in some ways on demographics, we came up with really different stuff in terms of especially access to nature for families with children. We saw high participation rates, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's accessible. And so there's some really neat findings here, illustrative findings here. And if you could talk more about how you got there, that would be helpful.
Yeah, and I am happy to share like the very wonky research document that the conservation science partners put together, because they are the real scientific minds behind this. But at its core, it is using a kind of brand new data set that they put together determining natural area loss. And so that uses more than a dozen different data sets, all combined kind of in different categories. So it's looking at urban development, it's looking at transportation, so highways, public transportation, trains, energy development, and agriculture. And so it's taking those various data sets in those 4 categories and coming up with kind of a comprehensive natural area loss for the entire country. And that is at, I think, 30-meter resolution. So it's pretty fine data. And then for this, we just overlaid census tract data to determine which communities had, compared to the state average, a plurality of, people of color or people of certain demographics. And that's how we kind of did the analysis to determine who was losing natural area.
Yeah, I just want to add that this this data set on nature loss found that the US is losing a football field's worth of nature every 30 seconds. And the addition of the census data told us who it's happening to. So it's really kind of an existential crisis for nature and for anyone who likes being in nature to do things.
Other questions for the group? From the group, excuse me.
So Kaylin, somebody in the chat mentioned an example from Michigan that I think it was Dan Lord. Did he want to talk about that a little bit? The Outdoor Adventure Center. And he mentioned it was a program for the downtown, and it was a sizable capital investment. I'd be interested to know where they got the funding for that.
And if you'd like to come off mute and share more, you're welcome to do so.
Better do it, Dan, or else I'm going to. So you should.
I say go for it, Brad.
I'll give Dan another minute. Yeah, so this is Project Our Natural Resources Agency in downtown Detroit along the riverfront. And yeah, big capital investment. I don't know all the details as well as Dan would, but
I'll jump in, Brad, when I'll fill in the blanks for you. Go ahead.
Yay, thank goodness. I was just about to dive into welcome. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll try to fill that one. So pretty unique for us. Actually, it's a historical structure down along the Detroit riverfront, part of the 5-mile revitalization efforts that have taken place down in the city. It's actually this part of what we call our Iron Bell Trail, which is another pretty unique recreational feature that goes from Detroit all the way up to Ironwood and the border with Wisconsin. But anyway, this building was treated as an acquisition. So we've got an internal grant program that has an acquisition arm and a development arm, and was really the end output of a lot of creative people that wanted to find a way to connect to a pretty big population cluster that were really unfamiliar with what the department had to offer. So hopefully you can see the link and the types of exhibits, but really meant to mimic, sand dunes, waterfalls, all the great natural features across the state towards school-aged groups. So a lot of the programming that takes place in there, there's a laboratory room. And it's been really cool to see how the space is springboarded. I mean, people have graduation parties there, weddings, all kinds of additional community events. So I think it's exceeded expectations for what it meant to give urban areas and understanding of what the state had to offer. Unfortunately, COVID has been a curveball. You know, if you go to the website, you'll see big disclaimers, but we're trying to recreate some of the programming out on Belle Isle, which is another amazing natural resource feature for anybody that's familiar with it in the city. And I'll just put a cork in it there, but you know, it's been really beneficial for us to engage in a lot of different ways. And again, try to springboard people to the outdoors.
That's a great example. Thanks for sharing. And it sort of turns to my last question around the importance of community engagement and outreach. Shauna, you mentioned that as one of the policy or sort of strategic recommendations and translation of materials. I'll just share with the group that one of the things that's being considered in Oregon for the 2021 legislative sessions would be new positions focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion outreach, both recruiting for decision-making bodies as well as outreach during rulemakings and other sort of processes in all of our natural resource agencies. Just wanted to see if you had either of you had anything more to add in terms of little quick tips or best practices on effective outreach. If you know our states are saying we're bought in, we want to do this, understanding we're small staffs, how best to achieve that.
I would say find your trusted community partners. In the Latino community, that can often be churches and pastoral leaders who really have great community connections with very hard to reach populations, and other community serving organizations. Like, there are surely people who work on this and who want to partner with you. You just have to make that connection.
Yeah, I think I would say something very similar to Shauna, just starting to make sure that you are engaging with the people who are suffering most from the nature gap, and you know, hiring advisory committees, public engagement, just who are you listening to, who's setting the agenda, and are there people from the affected communities, are there tribal members, just all, you know, good questions to ask and places to start.
Yeah, really helpful perspective, just kind of going upstream essentially and working with those trusted partners, kind of Jenny, as you said, too, in terms of programs that, you know, kind of a gold star strategy is not necessarily starting a new program, but partnering with those organizational leaders that are already trusted, doing the work, and just need some additional boost in capacity. So I just want to take the time to say thank you again for joining us, for sharing your expertise and this report, diving in deeper. Encourage everyone to go read the report in full, because there's a bunch more state level data that we didn't have time to dive into. And with that, I will hand it back over to Bevan and or Matt to close us out for a break. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. That was a great presentation, and thank you, Kaylin, for moderating that. And I will resend the report. That's one of the things I have on my list here, to resend that report to everybody. And yeah, don't worry, we're going to send all those great links that are in the chat as well.